What's up, everybody? In today's video, we're going to be looking at two phenomenal cameras from Canon, the 4-year-old R5 and the 2-year-old R6 Mark II. We're going to compare them based on performance, features, and value in 2025. So these cameras are not brand new, but they are still very much state of the art, and I want to talk about each of them and compare them because I think for a lot of folks, these might be the two cameras that you're looking at. And I want to compare them based on a number of factors and specifically a few different types of photographers. But before we get into the nitty-gritty of the specs and the features, and before we do kind of our head-to-head comparison, I want to get a couple of things out of the way. Number one, the assumption is in this case that you are either already a Canon shooter, meaning you've either got some RF or EF lenses, or maybe even an older or less capable Canon EOS camera, or that you have decided that Canon is the direction that you want to go. The second thing is, I'm going to assume that you are in some way or another a professional. Whether that means you're a stills photographer, a content creator, a videographer, a social media influencer or marketing person, YouTuber, TikToker, Instagrammer, but I'm going to assume that you are either making money with the work that you're going to be doing with these cameras. Next, when we talk about value, we're going to be talking about both relative value and total cost. And at the time of making this video, these two cameras are $500 apart. So now that we've kind of set up our ground rules, let's get into the head-to-head, and let's start by talking about what these two cameras have in common. So why did I pick these two cameras to compare? Number one, I own both of these cameras. If you are someone who is getting into photography with Canon or upgrading from a much lower end camera in the Canon ecosystem, these two cameras are the least expensive full frame professional cameras that Canon currently offers. So what do I mean by professional? But beyond the fact that they are full frame, it really, for me, comes down to two things. Number one, it has dual card slots. And number two, it supports log profile shooting in its video modes. And in the case of the R6 II and the R5, you are able to shoot in both Canon Log and Canon Log 3. Now, while the R5 Mark II does shoot in Canon Log 2, which is technically their more professional codec, I feel that the fact that they shoot in a log profile at all potentially qualifies them to be discussed as a professional camera. So now let's get into the meat of our comparison, where we're going to talk about features, performance, and value. And for each of these categories, I'm going to be comparing these cameras based on what I think are the two most common folks who are going to be picking these cameras up: professional stills shooters and a hybrid photography videography user. So let's start by talking about their sensors and their capabilities. So while it might seem like the R5 is the clear winner with the higher 45 megapixel sensor, the newer, more advanced 24 megapixel sensor that we have in the R6 Mark II actually wins in a handful of categories. Number one being readout speed. Readout speed is how quickly the entire sensor can have all of its pixels read out. Now, because of its newer construction and honestly lower megapixel rating, the sensor in the R6 Mark II can read out just a little bit faster than the R5. The R5 is rated at about 16.3 milliseconds for the entire sensor with the mechanical shutter, while the R6 Mark II is rated at about 14 milliseconds. Now that difference can be seen when shooting high-speed action subjects. That improved speed can reduce rolling shutter and that kind of jelly effect that you get when shooting video and moving horizontally. In my wobble testing, I actually really didn't notice much difference between the two cameras, although the R5 might have performed just a little bit better even in the fine mode, which is interesting considering the fact that it pulls the entire sensor. The R6 II also has better low light performance by about a half a stop of dynamic range. That's a result of both the newer construction and also the fact that the photo sites on a 24 megapixel sensor are going to be larger than those on a 45 megapixel sensor, meaning that they can collect more light and create less noise at higher ISO ratings. In fact, the ISO range on the R6 Mark II is double that of the R5. Using a 14-stop dynamic range card test at 4K 30, 400 ISO in IPB compression on both cameras, you notice that the noise is almost identical. Very well controlled, no problem there. When switching to 800, the noise on the R5 does get a little bit more pronounced. And when switching the R5 to all I, there's really no improvement. The R6 definitely wins. Switching to stills with an ISO 100 RAW file, you can see that there is a 13th stop that is somewhat visible. The 14th stop is basically missing completely, but you can see that in ISO 100, there's very little, if any, noise, even in those darker environments. Although one thing to notice is that the R5 for some reason is resolving about a quarter of a stop lower, and I really cannot explain that in stills testing. In the video test, however, they are effectively identical at ISO 100. Switching to 400 in the RAW, again, noise very well managed, almost no difference. Still seeing 13 stops available. When we switch to ISO 1600, the R5 definitely starts to get noisier. And maybe that's just perceived brightness on that additional stop, but it just looks very noisy, and again, about a quarter of a stop brighter. We get that same thing at ISO 3200. Again, looking here at the waveform, you can see it's just a little bit brighter for some reason. And then pushing it all the way to the max of the R5 at 51,200, you can actually see that the R5 is just it's just so noisy. Interestingly though, at 51,200, I lost a stop completely on the R6 II. I really couldn't explain it. I took the still image into Lightroom. I'm going to chalk it up to a glitch. Bringing saturation back into this high ISO image, you can see that even though the R5 can shoot at 51,200, the red color cast is super pronounced. And going up all the way to 102,400, we actually get that 13th stop back on the R6. And using the Lightroom denoise feature, you can see that it's there. The other thing to mention is that both of these cameras support Canon's 8-stop in-body image stabilization. Next, talking about the speed and the capability for taking high-speed action shots in both of these cameras. They're both extremely fast. Using the mechanical shutter, both cameras can shoot at 12 frames per second. But when moving to the electronic shutter, that's where things get a little different. The R5 can shoot at 20 frames per second continuously in its H+ mode using the electronic shutter. But the R6 Mark II can actually shoot at up to 40 frames per second. That's 40 frames per second in full resolution using the entire sensor in RAW. And while the R5 has a maximum shutter speed of 1/8,000th, the R6 in its electronic mode adds a 1/16,000th of a second shutter speed. So again, kind of showing off that new sensor and showing off the fact that it is very fast. Both cameras have flash sync capability up to 1/200th of a second in the full mechanical shutter mode, with a 1/250th of a second option in the electronic first curtain mode. Also, from a feature standpoint, both cameras have a built-in intervalometer. However, there's one more thing that I'd like to point out, which is the fact that on the R5, when shooting in mechanical, you will be getting 14-bit RAWs. However, when shooting in H+, regardless of the shutter mode that you use, the camera will go down to 13-bit. And when using the full electronic shutter, it will shoot at 12-bit. The R6 Mark II also drops down to 12-bit in the electronic shutter mode, but in mechanical, it is 14-bit in all shutter modes. Another advantage of the lower megapixel rating on the R6 Mark II is burst. The R6 Mark II can buffer up to 110 raw images, whereas the R5, using an SD card UHS-2, can only buffer up to 87. But of course, it does have the CF Express card slot, which allows the buffer to dump much faster, and it can actually run up to 180 full resolution RAWs. If you're shooting in JPEG, which I would strongly recommend against, the R6 II can shoot over 1,000 JPEGs before the buffer would run out. Honestly, I don't think that you can actually outrun the buffer shooting in JPEGs, whereas on the R5, you would outrun the buffer shooting about 350 JPEGs if you just held the button down. In my electronic shutter test of the buffer, you can see shooting in H+ mode on both cameras, the R6 definitely fills up its buffer faster, though it quickly dumps it and clears it out. The R5 just keeps shooting, and once it saturates the buffer, it actually clears it out even faster than the R6 II. This is with a CF Express card. Next, let's talk about the autofocus system for both of these cameras. Now, on paper, they are effectively the same system. They're both using Canon's dual pixel autofocus 2. So from a technical standpoint, as far as the sensors and the dual pixel autofocus points that you have within the sensor, they are the same. But from a software standpoint, there's considerable improvement in the R6 Mark II. Now, the R5 has over 5,900 autofocus points. Those are individual autofocus points that are selectable when using the one spot AF feature. That covers 100% of the width of the sensor and 90% of the height of the sensor. When switching to the autofocus areas within the whole area AF feature, you're actually able to pick over 1,000 focus areas that cover the entire sensor. The R6 Mark II has over 4,800 selectable individual points when using 1-point AF, and again, over 1,000 points when using whole area AF, and they both cover 100% of the sensor. So as far as autofocus points, I would say that that's about a wash. But when we get into how the camera actually uses those, well, that's when things get a little different. For one, the R5 has two autofocus modes. You have one shot and servo. One shot being that if you focus on a subject, the focus point will stay there, and servo being that it will move and track constantly. The R6 Mark II adds an additional mode called AI focus, where it's basically going to figure it out on its own. The R6 Mark II inherits this improved autofocus feature from the R3, as this is the next iteration in dual pixel autofocus 2. I almost feel like they should have called it dual pixel autofocus 3. And so while the R6 Mark II doesn't have the sensor that the R3 has, it got its autofocus algorithms, which puts it a significant improvement ahead of the R5. So with the additional features from the R3, the R6 Mark II gains improvements in things like eye detection. So while the R5 can absolutely detect things like heads and faces and eyes, with the R6 Mark II you can actually prefer one eye or the other. And while both cameras can track vehicles, animals, and people, the R6 Mark II has the ability to differentiate between cats, dogs, birds, and additionally horses. And now they've added the ability to track specifically trains and aircraft along with cars and motorcycles. So it's just a lot of iterative improvements in the algorithms and tracking of the R6 Mark II. But here's where we kind of put the specs away for just a sec. As someone who's used both of these cameras in a multitude of environments as it relates to autofocus specifically, I've used it in action shooting with sports, in portrait photography, in landscapes. The ability for the R6 Mark II in all of its modes, but specifically the AI focus mode, to be able to identify and track a subject, whether it's a person or a bird or a car, is just better. I would say it's twice as fast at picking up subjects, and it is immeasurably better at just sticking to them. I would honestly say that of all of the areas that we talk about related to a comparison between these two cameras, the one area where the R6 Mark II is invariably the absolute hands-down champion is in its autofocus performance. It's just fast and sticky. Now, we're not talking about video settings at the moment, but one thing I do want to mention when we discuss the difference in autofocus systems between these two cameras is the R6 Mark II also has the movie autofocus mode. So when you are focused on a subject and there are other subjects moving around, or that subject kind of moves in and out of frame, the camera will not attempt to refocus on anything else. It will stay locked on that subject.
Now, both cameras do have the AF function, which is the ability to rack smoothly. It's the R6 that has the detection priority that maintains focus regardless of what moves in and out of the frame.
Effectively, what this does is it eliminates a lot of undue racking in your videos. Next, let's talk about the EVF and the screen. Both of them have 1/2-inch OLED EVFs, but where the difference becomes really noticeable in looking through the EVF is the fact that on the R5, the EVF is actually 5.6 million dots, whereas on the R6 Mark II, it's only 3.6 million dots. But both of them are extremely bright, both of them are a 100% view, and both of them support up to 120 frame per second viewing. While I will say that the R6 Mark II was an upgrade over the R6 and definitely an upgrade over the R5, when I first looked into it, was the first time that I felt in a mirrorless camera like I was getting something that I used to see in my 6D Mark II or my 7D. It was the first time I felt more like I was looking through the lens. If that kind of thing is important to you and you're someone who shoots a lot through the viewfinder, the R5 definitely has the better specs. Now, both cameras have Canon's vari-angle screen system for their rear screens. Both have that full 8-axis turn, flippy, dippy featuriness, and both are around 3 inches. The R5's is just slightly larger with about a half a centimeter more over the R6. But the other area where the R5 has the leg up on the R6 Mark II is the fact that it actually has more pixels. The R6 Mark II has a 1.6K dot screen, and the R5 is a 2.1K dot screen. While we're talking about the rear of the camera, let's just for a moment go over the buttons, because to be quite honest, on the rear of the camera here, the buttons are almost identical. In fact, well, they are identical. The exact same number of buttons that you have, the same buttons themselves, are on both cameras, including the multi-function joystick. But there is one difference. On the front of the R5, you do have this N3 remote release port to be able to control the camera remotely, whereas on the R6, that is not there. Otherwise, you do have the mount release button here. You have the LED assist, obviously the shutter button, and your depth of field preview button. On the left side of the camera, you pretty much have the same stuff. You have your headphone jack, you have your microphone jack, you have your USB-C, you have your micro HDMI out. Both of these cameras have micro HDMI. Neither of them has a full-size HDMI port, but they're both micro HDMI, so they're both bad. Now, the R5 has a flash sync port here, which you do not have on the R6 Mark II. In its place, you have a shutter release control port, which again, the R5 doesn't have because it has this N3 release port in the front. Now on the top of the camera, really what you have is a slightly higher end top control system for the R5 and a more kind of newer, more iterated version in the R6 Mark II. Specifically the fact that the R5 has this little OLED panel. I kind of miss the old days of the DSLRs with the large kind of old school LCD panel that you saw kind of everything on. And that's not really what this is, but you do have this little top-down panel. It does light up. You can see it there in the dark. And the R5 has a lock button, the record switch, your top wheel and multifunction button, whereas on the R6 Mark II, the lock button is replaced with a switch position on the on-off button, which has now been moved over to the right-hand side of the camera. But it still has the top dial, it still has the multifunction switch, it still has the record button. And on the R6 II, instead of having this LCD screen with the mode button and dial where you would push and select which mode you want, it just has a basic dial, which in my opinion is actually nicer. And where the on-off switch is on the R5, that has been switched with the movie and still image mode button or selector on the R6 Mark II. On the R5, to get into that feature, you have to hit mode and then info to switch into your movie mode of choice. And that is annoying. Lastly, on the right side is your memory door to get into where you have your cards. In this case, we have one CF Express slot, one SD UHS-2 slot on the R5. On the R6 Mark II, you have 2 UHS-2 SD slots. Now, I absolutely love shooting lots of still photos on the R5, specifically because I can really easily get those images off using the CF Express. The CF Express is also cheaper per gigabyte to purchase. And while I appreciate the fact that there are 2 card slots on this camera as well as the R6 Mark II, the fact that they don't match actually creates some weirdness when you're trying to do backup shooting. Your buffer will actually be smaller if you're doing shooting on both. And also you have to keep in mind that when shooting video, you cannot shoot the same video modes to both. There are certain modes that you can shoot to the SD card and modes that you can shoot to the CF Express card. On the R6 Mark II, there is no such restriction. You can basically record to fill up a card, switch to the next card, keep recording. You'll notice no difference. And if you're doing multiple records or dual shooting to both cards, again, you'll notice no difference in the R6 Mark II. I will say though, on the R5, this door, it's better. It just feels more on the R5. Next, let's talk about video modes. So both of these cameras come with a plethora of different settings for video features. But the one thing that I will say right off the bat is that selecting the video mode is just easier on the R5. You pick your resolution, then you pick your codec, then you pick your frame rate. It's just easy. Both cameras support the MP4 container. Both cameras support H.264 recording in 8-bit and H.265 recording in 10-bit, and both record in 4:2:2 compression when shooting in 10-bit log profile. Both cameras support Canon log and Canon log 3, and both cameras support shooting in Rec. 709, Rec. 2020, as well as Canon's Cinema Gamut color space. And again, the configuration options here can get a little dizzying, as the R5 can shoot in both UHD 4K and DCI 4K. But that's not all. The R5 also gives you the ability to shoot in 8K with every codec. So you can shoot in both RAW, RAW Light, All-I, IPB, and IPB Light. In 4K, you can shoot in All-I, IPB, and IPB Light. But wait, there's more. In 4K on the R5, you can actually pull the entire sensor in a downsampled 8K mode, which is incredibly crisp and clean and clear. And you can do this in either DCI 4K or UHD 4K. And then you can do it in 60, 30, and 24 frames per second. And then you can do it in All-I. You can do it in IPB. You can do it in IPB Light. You see what I mean by the fact that there's just a lot of options here.
Testing sharpness at 4K 30 on both cameras, I am using the fine mode on the R5 because technically the R6 is always in fine mode. You can see that certain details look to be resolved just a little bit better on the R5. These were shot with identical settings on both. And when we start zooming into this darker area, this black piece of plastic on the Canon AE1, you can actually see that the noise on the R5 is both a little bit more pronounced and also has that red color cast. Looking at this color card, kind of same thing in the non-fine mode, you can definitely see a difference in the R5's sharpness. And then when we switch to the All-I mode, there's really no difference. But when we switch to fine mode, that resolution comes back and you definitely see the improved sharpness on the R5 sensor.
And in the high frame rate mode, you can choose to shoot in 4K DCI, 4K UHD, or full HD at 120 frames per second. And the R5's autofocus 2 system is fully capable in all of those modes, and I've not noticed that any one of them is better than another. They all just kind of work the same way that you do with photos. Servo AF just works. But not as well as AI focus does on the R6 II with its improved focus algorithms. But where the R6 Mark II really falls down is in its video mode options. Other than the time-lapse modes, you basically just have 4K, UHD, and full HD. That's it. Now in full HD, you can go up to 180 frames per second. And in 4K, you can go up to 60 frames per second. But that's pretty much it. You're also locked to IPB and IPB Light. So what are some of these codecs? Well, basically, RAW is RAW. It's like a raw still image. Every pixel as it's read on the sensor is recorded to the video file. With All-I, which stands for All Intra, every single frame is recorded to the video file as it is presented, though MPEG compression is used on each frame, but every frame is there. IPB, which really doesn't stand for anything, it represents the different frames that are recorded throughout the process. Or I guess all of them are I frames. You have a P frame and a B frame. P frames record the changes from the previous frame, and B frames are kind of a calculated prediction between frames. So there's a lot of algorithmic compression and assumption that's going into these images, which means that they are more prone for artifacting, they are not potentially as sharp, and when you load them into your editor, they take a lot of time to decompress and edit and recompress, right? Your editor needs to do all the work of putting all of those pieces back together when you cut or join clips together. Whereas with All-I, it's just every frame. The R6 Mark II does not give you the option to shoot in All-I. It's just not an option, unless you're shooting a time lapse. So while IPB and IPB Light recording can be much smaller, the quality can be lower, and the work that you're going to have to do after the fact in your computer is going to be higher. Now, is that the end of the world? No. To be quite honest, when I shoot most of these videos, I shoot in IPB Light on the R6 II because I find that my M1 Max MacBook Pro has no problem editing it. I appreciate the savings on the storage, and I don't really notice a huge difference in the quality, especially when I'm compressing down to upload for YouTube. But the bummer is the fact that you don't really have the option. Now, one area where the R6 Mark II actually kind of redeems itself is the fact that through its HDMI port, you can connect an external recorder and actually record up to 6K RAW 60 and 3.7K RAW 60 while being able to record internal proxy files to the SD card in full HD 12-bit or 10-bit. But that requires an external recorder, and external recorders like the Atomos Ninja can be $500, $600, $700, $800 depending on which one you get, and you're going to need storage for that. So while the features are technically there, you do have to invest in additional equipment to access them. I would also mention that in the 8K RAW modes on the R5, you can also shoot proxies to the card that are also full HD. But as someone who shoots a lot of video on the R6 Mark II, I can tell you that the 4K signal is downsampled from the 6K sensor. It looks amazing. You don't have to use any sort of fine mode or high quality mode to get that downsampled 4K. It's just always there. Whereas on the R5, you do have to tell it that you want that setting. And that comes with its own sacrifices that we'll talk about in just a second. But additionally, on the R6, because I shoot with a lot of LED lights that, well, some of them just aren't designed to be on camera and they flicker. The R6 Mark II has a flicker video mode that allows you to preset within fractions of a second. I can't dial that in on the R5 like I can on the R6 II, and that is one huge advantage in the video modes on the R6. Hey everybody, I just want to break in really quick and tell you again about my Instagram giveaway. I get products all the time from companies asking me to review them, and I do the review and I post it on the channel, and then I don't have anything to do with that gear. So I want to give it to you. So I'm running an Instagram giveaway contest, and if you check out this short video here, which I will link above and below, watch that, get the instructions, and follow those instructions to get entered to win some of the gear that I have. I'm going to be giving away a ton of free stuff. So now let's talk about heat and time limitations. On the R5, I am limited to 29 minutes and 58 seconds. So I have here a 256 gigabyte CF Express card. And if I were to configure this into what is my kind of normal setting for something like this, which is 4K UHD 2398 in IPB Lite in C-Log 3 with Cinema Gamut, I should conceivably be able to record for like 6 hours onto this card. But all I see is 2959. On the R6 Mark II, there is no such limitation. You can record for as long as the card will allow, and that's it. I normally shoot on 128 gig SSDs, and I can shoot over 2.5 hours without any trouble. But now to what is likely the hottest topic in this comparison, overheating. This is literally warm as I touch it. The R5 definitely gets hot. Now, they've improved that over time with firmware updates and with tweaks to various algorithms and settings and menu options and all that sort of thing. And if I'm shooting stills on my R5, I will never run into heating problems, even out in the sun on a warm day. Additionally, if I'm shooting in 4K 23 in any one of the compression modes, I have never run into a heating issue. But the minute that you go from 4K 24 or 4K 30 up to 4K 60, or the high frame rate mode at 4K 120, or if you switch into 8K, or if you turn on the 4K fine mode where it will pull the whole sensor and oversample it down to 4K, the clock starts running. It's currently 75 degrees in this room, pretty standard most of the time for me, to 4K 60. What was a 29:59 clock becomes a 20-minute clock. And if I switch it, for example, to 8K, that's now a 10-minute clock. And it looks like if I set it to the fine mode and I set it to 30 frames per second all I get 15 minutes. That's inside, no sunlight, and it's 74, 75 degrees. I have seen this camera overheat on me when shooting video in that way, especially when I'm shooting high frame rate video. It's just a thing that happens. But I've kind of come to expect it, and I don't use those additional modes all the time. I mostly use them for B-roll, for establishing shots if I'm in a beautiful place and I want to use that 4K fine mode or the 8K mode, or if I'm doing B-roll and I need that high frame rate mode. Otherwise, I'm normally shooting in the standard 4K mode in UHD in 24p. And if I run into heating problems, I can switch into that mode and I don't have any issues. And if I turn the camera off for 5 or 10 minutes, I can normally turn it back on and I'll be able to use most of those modes for 5 or 10 or 15 more minutes anyway. But the fact remains, the camera does overheat. The R6 Mark II, I have never ever seen it overheat. But honestly, it doesn't do anything that would cause it to overheat. It doesn't have a fine mode. It's kind of always in fine mode. It's always in IPP compression, there's no RAW. And if you were shooting in RAW with an external recorder, the external recorder is gonna be doing most of the work. And normally those have fans. I'm sure if you were recording for a long time using the 4K oversampled at 60p, you could probably run into a heating issue if you were outdoors in the sun on a warm day. But I've never run into that myself. But again, if you are a stills shooter, you're never gonna run into this problem. And if you're a hybrid shooter, just know that you can always switch the R5 into one of the other video modes or continue shooting stills without any problems. And while the overheating problem might limit your ability to access some of those additional features, those features just don't exist on the R6 Mark II. So I think we've covered the kind of core fundamental areas where we traditionally would do our research to decide if a camera is the right camera for us. We've talked about the sensor, we've talked about autofocus, we've talked about speed, and for our hybrid shooter, we've talked about video features. And for just about everybody, we've talked about the ergonomics and the outside of the camera. But now I want to tell you a few things that I can tell you as someone who has owned both cameras and things that were honestly a surprise when I switch between one and the other for various tasks. Number one, and I've mentioned this before when we talked about autofocus, is just how good the autofocus in the R6 II is. I can't exactly put my finger on it, but it's just better. But that really is use case dependent. When I'm shooting portraits, families, or landscapes, I'm grabbing the additional resolution. Even though the dynamic range is better on the R6 II and the autofocus is considerably better, when it comes to those types of photography situations, I'm grabbing the R5. But if I was shooting more action and sports, the R6 II would definitely be the direction that I would be in. Resolution be damned. Next, for hybrid shooters, if you are using an external display, and I've reviewed a few on the channel, I'll go ahead and link those up above, I want to pre-warn you that the R6 Mark II, you cannot display both on the external monitor and on the internal screen when you're going to be recording internally. So if your plan is to use an external recorder like an Atomos Ninja that is also a screen, you're fine, and both screens will operate. But if your plan is to use internal recording, just know that your monitor will receive your HDMI signal, but your screen will not. And because the monitor and the camera don't really talk to each other in a touchscreen kind of way, you will be manipulating menu features using the buttons on the back of the camera while looking at your screen, while looking at your external monitor. You will not be able to utilize the actual touchscreen that's attached to your camera. That was not something that I knew until I attached an external monitor to my R6 Mark II. And then I was very surprised when I attached that same screen to my R5 and it didn't do that. From what I've been able to determine, that is a result of the electronics inside the R6 Mark II and the fact that basically it can only send those streams so many places. It's going to send it to the screen and to the external monitor, or to the external monitor and the SD card, but basically not both. So if you know you're going to be using a screen and you're going to be recording externally, you'll be fine. But if you're going to record internally, know that you're going to run into a few problems. Next, also for our hybrid shooters, is the record button. So both of these cameras have a record button on the top, and both of these cameras have a movie mode and a stills mode. So what happens when you hit the record button while you're in stills mode? Well, it depends. One of these cameras does something really annoying, and the other one does something really cool. On the R6 Mark II, when you hit the record button, it goes into its, I think it's the scene mode or its P mode, but it's basically a mode that you can't define and you can't edit it or change it. On the R5, when you hit the record button, it goes directly to the movie mode side of custom function 3, which you can fully define. And next, something that I really didn't expect and really loved about the R6 Mark II was the battery life. Now, both of these cameras came standard with E6 NH batteries. These are 2100 milliamp batteries, but I can tell you for a fact that the R6 Mark II, it lasts, I don't know if I could say it lasts twice as long as the R5. It might be twice as long, both in still shooting and in video. Now, I don't run into a lot of battery issues with the R5, so for hybrid shooters, that might be a big deal, especially if you find yourself on location a lot and you don't want to lug around as many batteries. So those are the things that have made a difference for me as a nature and landscape photographer who is also a portrait and family photographer who is also a hybrid shooter and content creator. But getting down to brass tacks, and they're very close together. If you are an action photographer, you shoot a lot of sports and action, you've already got some lenses, or you're already in the Canon system, or maybe you're in wildlife and you've got a couple of really long lenses, I think the R6 makes perfect sense. I think there's no question. The faster readout speed, the better rolling shutter performance, the much higher ISO capability, and the 40 frame per second burst in the electronic shutter mode, combined with the improvements to dual pixel autofocus 2, honestly, it's a no-brainer. No question, that's what you need to be doing. I would also say if you're a still shooter that shoots mostly at night, the additional dynamic range is worth it for the resolution if that's all you shoot. Okay, so sports, action, wildlife, still shooter. If you are a portrait photographer, wedding photographer, families, headshots, landscapes, it is worth it to go with the R5 in 2025. It just is. This is the one that you should get because that's me. I am it. I love adventure photography. I love landscapes, but I make money as a portrait photographer and shooting families and kids and couples and birthdays. And this is the camera that I've done my last 100 shoots with. And at 12 frames per second mechanical, I still don't find that many photos where I miss focus. It's still quite good. Plus, you get CF Express, you get the better EVF. And while I do burn through batteries a little bit faster, that's not as big a deal for me. But I'm also a content creator and hybrid shooter where I create adventure videos and reviews and news videos here on YouTube. If I was buying one camera to do all of that, it would still be the R5. I'm shooting on the R6 II now because I have the R5 and because my output medium is YouTube, where you're not going to notice the difference between 4K fine mode and 4K IPB light that's a downsampled 6K image that is still phenomenal. But if I swap these two out, you really wouldn't notice the difference. And I would still be shooting in 4K UHD, 24p, IPB light, log, cinema gamut. So I know that this video has been pretty long, and I know that we've gone over a lot of stuff, and I've given you a lot of my opinions, and I know that there are going to be people that disagree with me. But let me just give you one last summary. This is the one thing that you take from this video, is that I have both of these cameras, and I use both of these cameras. I am a professional photographer who gets paid to shoot families and kids and people and events. I also am a content creator on YouTube where I also get paid. And knowing what I know, having both cameras, if I had to choose between the two, I'd get the R5. Now, if I was an action photographer doing sports and wildlife, I would get the R6 Mark II. I would need the speed and I would need the autofocus. But that's pretty much the only scenario in which I would not choose the R5, even being 4 years old and with the overheating issues that it has. For me, it just hasn't been an issue. But again, I know that this has been a long video and I appreciate all of you sticking with me. I hope that I've been able to answer some questions for you if you are in that place where you're trying to decide between the 2-year-old camera and the 4-year-old camera because you're trying to get your dollar to stretch a little bit further. You're trying to get a little bit more pro. You're trying to get those better video features. You want that IBIS. You want dual pixel autofocus. And this is where you're at. These two cameras, the 4-year-old R5 is still your best bet in almost every scenario. Well, I didn't choose. I bought them both, so never mind. But having them both, I do consider the R6 Mark II my B camera and my R5 is my A camera. Again, don't forget about my Instagram giveaway. Again, those videos are linked above and below. If you want to purchase either of the cameras that we talked about today, there are links down below. Those are affiliate links, so I do get a little bit when you purchase through those links. That is one way that you can support the channel. Another way that you can support the channel is to join the memberships. I've set up memberships on the channel. It's a couple of bucks a month. It goes a long way to supporting me, and with that you get all sorts of things like custom icons and emojis, first response on comments. I'm gonna be doing live chats. I'm releasing videos early to my members, as well as sending out resources like LUTs and Lightroom presets, and some of the resources that I've created here on the channel as a photographer and content creator on YouTube. So check out memberships down below to get access to all of that. But one free way that you can support the channel is by clicking on the subscribe button, clicking on the like button, and turning on the bell so you get notified when I make new videos. Thank you so much for watching. Please, 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 if you have questions about these cameras or the experiences that I have had owning both of them side by side as a portrait, landscape, and hybrid photographer, let me know down in the comments and I'd be happy to get into it with you. But again, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.